Hey, welcome back to Programming Through Mobile App Development. This is going to be CSS Basics and Refresher. Now that we've done our refresher on HTML, we can get into a refresher on CSS before we move on to more in-depth stuff in JavaScript land. So let's get to it. What's coming? We have basically what is CSS, as I like to do. We sort of define what is this language about. What's its origins in a way. Writing CSS, and that's got a lot of subcategories. We're going to talk about syntax for writing CSS, what properties are available, which selectors are, where to write it, how priority works, all that kind of stuff. So lots to get through. Let's keep it moving. So here is a simple example homepage. This is right from the W3 School site. This is a simple page. This is a strictly HTML page, right? Welcome to my home page. Use this menu, it says, even though it's really just a paragraph, you can tell, and an unordered list of things that they're not even links. And then same page, different style sheets, blah, blah, blah. So it sort of explains itself a bit, but you can tell this is all just basic HTML structural information, right? We can look at the code just briefly. There's a lot more here, like there's a lot of divs helping to separate things, but the content you can see if you zoom in a little bit. So near the top, we have a header, right? We have a paragraph. We have, various things here. Some of this is more advanced than you've seen so far in the refreshers, but rest assured, it's really just a bunch of, for the most part, containers, so the divs, and then the content informational stuff that you've seen before. You see the unordered list and the list items. You keep going down. You see a bunch of A anchors. So those are the links halfway down the page, all that. To show you what CSS can do to help really, ground it first, let's watch what this demo is supposed to do. So if in the demo, we click on Style Sheet 1, this is the exact same HTML, but it's now been rendered using CSS. It has been styled. You can see, at the top there's the welcome to my homepage section is now like a title bar. Those first items, the UL list items, the unordered list, whoa, that's like a whole set of buttons now. Even though I assure you at the heart of it, those are still UL, so unordered list, and LI, list items. It's just they are differently styled. They've changed their shape. They've changed their location on the screen. They've changed tons of things about how this stuff is organized on the page. We see now that there was a piece of it labeled sidebar, which makes a lot more sense now over on the right side, the blue sidebar section. There's a segment at the very bottom that was just sort of leftover bottom text. Let's quote unquote click another style sheet. Boom. All the same content. The HTML did not change, but the styles have all been applied in a different way. Different color scheme, roughly similar format to the previous one. All the content is still organized in little sections together, right? The sidebar is still connected to itself, right? The bottom text is still its own thing, but they've been rearranged. They've been moved. We can keep going. Here's another style sheet, the third style sheet. This looks a little more like the original in its structure, but it's still got better colors and more stuff going on with the tags. Keep going, we get this sort of matrixy looking one. It's very like the dark mode version of itself. And again, the sidebar is the sidebar. The bottom is the bottom. The welcome to my homepage section, while this time it's not really like a top bar with like a navigation bar or anything, it's still grouped together and it's still there. All the same content, all different ways, all laid out just with CSS. All the same HTML, but different styles applied. So that, I hope, sets the stage for you to sort of gather what the goal of being able to wield CSS is about, right? You can now take the raw structural stuff and make it look like something, right? Because the original one really doesn't look like anything. And I hope you can also see, the difference between the raw one here and one of these sort of still relatively simple pages, but this gets you closer to what you might be used to seeing in commercial websites and professional websites, right? So let's get into what exactly is CSS. We're already jumping into a second language. Let's try and focus on what's the difference and what's the point of this one. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It doesn't even really sound like a language, but it is a language of style. So designed to give your document style. So CSS is our second language after HTML. It stands for Cascading Style Sheets, of course. Style sheet meaning the text files or places within files where you are defining style rules, right? That's what the style sheet part means. And then cascading, it's a little trickier concept, but it has to do with the way that those sheets can propagate through the pages on your site, the sort of order in which they are generally applied, and the idea that you can, have lots of different styles, define different places, and how they all kind of flow together. It's still not a programming language, right? HTML was not either. And in general, CSS is fairly static, right? You define it once, and then your page will load. You define your style rules once, and then in like a CSS file or within your HTML files, and then the system will apply those styles. They're fairly consistent. So let's contrast CSS and HTML. HTML was all about describing the content and structure. So what elements are on a page and how those elements are organized, right? The nested structure of lists or tables or even, the one that we just saw where there's multiple containers that kind of keep things grouped together, right? That's all the HTML, the content and the structure. CSS is about the presentation. So how those elements and containers and everything, how they should look, their locations, overall how the page will look to the user. And in general, the point is not that these things, CSS is more fancy, right? These are meant to be used together, right? You can't really use one without the other. They are just both different faces of how you, the programmer, the app developer, can interface with the DOM, the structure that, is rendering everything. So they're designed to work together. In this little example here, if HTML is your skeleton and CSS is how you look on the outside, these things are kind of important to each other. They don't really function without each other. So let's keep going with the definition. So style sheets. What are we talking about with style sheets? How we dress up our document. So once you've defined your structure of your HTML, it's in the strictest sense, it's fully functional, right? One could read everything on the page. One could click all of the links and the bullet points. You could make sure you understand that these things are separated by bullet points, blah, blah, blah. It is the most dry, technical type of writing that you can kind of get, right? And if you're used to writing papers in a Word document, this looks familiar, right? This sort of a dry, simple version of it. But there's a reason that not everything you click online is organized like a term paper, right? So yeah, it's all there, but it's not exciting. But the style really helps you aid the user experience tremendously. Like, it's not just about, it looks fancy. It's about the color and the empty space and highlighting and how you arrange things and group them together, and not just one gigantic linear column. These things help inform the user, and you guide their attention, right? Even just looking on the right-hand side, now you suddenly see that these things are not all the same kind of information. In the top version, everything is just sort of listed in a vertical scroll, so you might think, okay, these are all paragraphs that I should read. But really, some of it is navigational, some of it is an aside, some of it is the main body text in the middle, and some of it is sort of bottom text where you might put contact information or whatever, right? These things are not all, their locations and their colors and the different ways that you style them are instructing the viewer instinctively that, oh, these are all different. I can break this up conceptually, right? So there is a huge added value to the way you style things. You don't have to become super fancy, but CSS enables you to at least pay basic attention to user experience type things. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the cascading idea. Cascading. In CSS land, it sort of has a lot to do with the order of priority of rules. In a basic sense, a cascading waterfall is one where the water flows down into multiple pools, and then those pools may have their own waterfalls that flow down into other pools, and so on. That's just in case you weren't even sure what cascading actually meant. Applied to CSS, this is the idea that your styles that you define at one source are allowed to flow downstream to other pages and other elements and such. So we'll get into a little bit more detail about that later in this segment, but this concept in general, the idea is that it allows you a few different things. For one, it allows you to then have a consistent site-wide style that you define in just one place, right? Think of that as the main water flow. And then it allows you to then go a level deeper, where if you say one piece of your site, one piece of your app, you might want to style a lot differently, right? Say your contact page or something, or your front-end page, whatever. This allows you to set rules for styling things that are more specific, right? And all the way down to, you can then style individual things as needed. So while perhaps every paragraph on your page, on your whole website, uses one specific font, you can then tweak the individual font down to the level of an individual item, right? So there's tons of detailed priority rules about like which styles will take precedence. I don't want to get bogged down on that right now, but I wanted to give you this guiding idea. What it all boils down to is, the more specific a rule might be on your site, the more priority it will have. So you can define everything with one file for your whole website, and then as you go into individual files or individual elements, you can tweak things, right? And that's what this little layout on the site, your site styles might be everywhere, but then as you go down into more specific situations, you might restyle things in different ways. Okay, so that's the idea of the cascade. Let's recap quickly. CSS is a language for defining style. To do so, you define style rules for the various elements of your page. Those styles can be defined for your whole site, or just one page, or just one element, with specific usually beating general in terms of which ones take priority. And all to the point that you can present the information on your page in something other than plain black on white text in a vertical scroll, right? The hint being, human eyes aren't actually good at that. That's not a way that we like to see information. Human eyes like colors and shapes and organization. To even the barest hint of it will help people navigate what you're presenting to them. So let's get to writing CSS. How can we make this happen for our own pages, right? So with the writing section on this one, we got lots of subsections. So let's talk about the bits. First, we'll go over the syntax of defining a style rule. We'll go over what properties are available, what kinds of selectors you will have to use. You'll know what that means in a second. Where you can write CSS. There's lots of ways to get CSS into your code, and then a bit of that more on that cascade priority stuff, just because it's useful to have a little bit of a working understanding. So syntax first. How a style rule is written in CSS. So a single CSS rule is generally written as follows. You will use a selector to indicate what elements of the page are you even trying to alter, right? For example, H1 in this scenario means every H1 header on my page will get this style rule applied to it. Then you make a number of declarations within the rule. So in this example, there is one declaration made. It's saying the property of color I'm going to set to the value blue. Now we'll talk in a bit about what's available for colors, but blue being the value and property is color. So taken all together, this is a single style rule that will define how every element that matches the given selector should look on the page. So all this style rule is saying is, I want my headers to have blue text, right? So sure. Now, getting into what is actually available, right? This is it. You could write a million style rules just changing colors using this concept that already. You could run out there and start writing them. But let's talk about a little more in depth what's available to change and what kinds of values are appropriate. So, what can we change about an HTML element? What properties can we change? There are tons. A few basic ones we'll cover: fonts, colors, width and height, and margins and padding. We'll get into each one. There's a longer list available for reference on the W3 Schools site, the CSS ref subpage. It's super great. Always that site is your desk reference for this. There's no textbook. That website is the textbook for this and all things for web dev. So, okay, let's go into fonts. Font properties. There's a few different properties associated here with fonts and that we can change things with. First is the font family property. So this one allows you to specify either exact fonts like Arial or Helvetica, for example. Those are fonts you're probably familiar with, or Times New Roman, right? You can specify an exact font, or you can specify just sort of a general family of fonts, because you're not always sure, what browser is my person who's loading this web page using, what fonts do they even have available. So you can say things like, well, I do want serifs, or I don't want serifs, so I use a sans serif font, or I want monospace. And if you look at the top, you can see kind of what serifs are, right? A sans serif has no text decoration like those little edges, the serifs, whereas sans serifs have none of that. And then monospace is kind of like the text of the word monospace is a monospace font. That's most code is written monospace because you need to, keep your information aligned and not have it all styled out of proportion. And that can be quite useful. If you pay attention from here on, you'll see I use monospace fonts quite a lot in both the lectures and in the lab content. Okay, so font family. This is essentially like when you highlight text in Word and you just say, hey, change the font to something new. You can also define the font weight as normal or bold, and the font style as normal or italic. There's other options too, but they're subtle and different. These are the kind that you will need to keep track of, right? So if you want basic capacities of changing fonts on a page, then keep these three things in mind, primarily font family, but the font weight and style are also useful. And also, here's a quick look at what different fonts look like. This one at the top, we've got font family Garamond, and these use the first one of each line. Something to note about this, the reason these are defined with multiple fonts available is that if the user's interface doesn't have a particular font available, it'll fall back to the next one, right? So each one of these shows a different font. You have our Comic Sans down there. We have Courier, right? And the way you kind of do this is you would specify the exact font you want, and then you would sort of roll down to more and more likely stuff until you get to a super generic. It's like, oh, okay, if all else fails, I just want some kind of monospace font. So, hey, whoever's loading this page, please find whatever monospace font works. Yeah, so simple stuff. Colors. So we have the foreground, the background, and both preset and custom colors available. So the main color properties are color and background color. Color is usually the foreground, like text. If you think about what exactly is an HTML element, well, it's usually a bunch of blank space and some text, right? So color defines, in that scenario, the text, whereas background color is the rest of the element out to the bounding box. You can see here a bunch of colors, tomato, orange, Dodger blue, medium sea green, gray, slate blue, violet, etc. And so there's tons of predefined color names, and those are the ones on the right here. There's more than just these, but this is a set of examples to highlight that for you. And so when you define color, you can use a name like a simple red or blue or tomato or Dodger blue or whatever. But you can also do custom coloring, which I think is far more powerful and far more useful in general. But it means you have to get comfortable with hexadecimal notation. So let's jump into what the heck that is. Hexadecimal numbering system. So the decimal part should sound kind of familiar. That's our normal numbering system. Hexadecimal is a numbering system whereas decimal numbers are what we're used to. So the deca means 10 in decimal, meaning 10 values per digit. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 10 available values for each digit, right? Hexadecimal means 16 values per digit. So it goes from 0 up through 9 and then A, B, C, D, E, F, right? There's a lot of reasons why hexadecimal exists. It converts very cleanly to binary, which is sort of the natural language of computers. But what it means here is that you have available to you in just 2 digits, you can get the number values of 0 through 255 because there's 16 values per digit, and you have 2 digits, so you multiply them. So when you're defining colors using hexadecimal, you would use 2 digits, so 255 values for each color, right? And red is first, green is second, and blue is third. RGB, right? So examples of colors, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 would be black, right? I want no red, no green, and no blue, therefore black. Whereas at the opposite end of the spectrum, I want maximum color of all 3. So I want F, 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 F. That would be 255 white, 255 green, 255 blue. That's the maximum that the monitor is going to output. We get white. More examples on the right-hand side show the colors I typically use in my lectures and other places. This is my sort of general color scheme. FFOOFF is this hot pink I use so often. It's that means maximum red, no green, maximum blue. Probably, I think people refer to that more as magenta, but whatever. The next one is sort of an indigo. Then we have the color cerise, and then we have aqua, I think is the label of this color. But the point is that these are all defined by these simple 6-digit codes of hexadecimal colors. One last note in HTML land and in most places is that you can actually add 2 more hexadecimal digits to these codes to give them an alpha value, meaning how transparent you want it to be. So 00 would be completely invisible, and FF would mean just completely opaque, and somewhere in between you could get some scaling going. Make things kind of fade and overlay each other with some transparency. So that's hexadecimals. It's super quick crash course, but the idea is very useful, and if you hang on to only a few things, this kind of stuff is important. Knowing what hexadecimals means you're going to speak the language of color in the online space. So let's keep moving to a different set of properties. Width and height, big to small, squash and tall. So both width and height do what you might expect. They let you set the dimensions of whatever element you're selecting for. So for example, over here we have paragraph defined with various widths and heights. So the top left one is defined with the width of 100 pt. That means point. It's like the same dimensions you would use for fonts. We'll talk about this in a sec. So I've defined the width and height of this paragraph as 100. For the one on the right, upper right, you have the width is defined as 200 point, but the height stays the same. Bottom left, you've got height 200, and then bottom right, both height and width are set to 200. So just getting you a sense of these are how these changes will propagate to your your visual style here. So the real variety comes in the units that are available for you to use. PT means points, kind of like in fonts, like I said. So it's that holdover from paper print. 72 points means 1 inch on printed paper. I would use points if you are intending to print your document, but really I would lean more towards pixels, because those are the basic unit of digital interfaces, right? So pixels just means the number of pixels on the screen that the object should take up, right? So 1 pixel is 1 dot on your screen. And this, illustrated at the bottom here, is also how that hexadecimal color system works, right? You have individual dots that you are rendering something, right? So you have this eye, you zoom in a bit, you start to see the pixelation, right? But you keep zooming into the pixels and you see they are individually made up of individual little lights lit up in different ways, right? The brighter spots, all of the lights are brighter. In the dimmer, darker spots, they're all shut off, right? Here, the center of the pupil. So and F, right? So the color scheme here is defined as that same as the hexadecimal code, right? Okay, so that's pixels. That's how I tend to work. But another very useful one that you can set as a parameter here is percentage. So you can make an element take up a certain amount of the available space to it. So, for example, if you set width to 50% for a paragraph object sitting inside the body, just like in the main container of the whole page, that's basically saying, I want this paragraph to be allowed to take up 50% of the available space of the whole document, of the width of the document. But that same width equals 50% applied to a table data element inside of a table row would mean that table data element would take up half the width of the table, not the whole document, right? So it's all relative to that relative sizing is super useful, because typically when you're arranging things, you don't want to get down to the nitty-gritty math of like, oh, this element should be exactly 10 pixels. And if the screen size changes, well, all my math is thrown out, right? Percentage allows you to set up your pages to be flexible. They can scale properly to different sizes and such. Okay, so that's width and height, with pixels thrown in. Margins, borders, and padding. Now, this also uses the same dimensional structure, but now we're not talking about the size of the element alone. We're talking about the spacing around the content of an element. So, yeah, you can set the dimensions for the space. Border is for the outline of the content. So let's say in a table you want to draw clearer lines between the columns and rows, you might set up a border. Padding is sort of the breathing room between whatever the content is, usually text, and the edge, the border, right? That boundary of what this element actually is. So sort of think of it as internal white space, whereas margin is the external white space. So the space between the boundary and other objects on the page. So how much space should I give this thing? An example of one that is typically set up with this as pretty large vertical margins is headers, right? You think of a header, there's a reason that it's visible. And it's not just the font size, it's also that it's sort of alone. It stands out because they have, by default, the browser has cleared a bunch of vertical space to make it so that it stands on its own. All of these use the same dimensional units as width and height, so point, pixel, and percent. Again, I typically work in pixels, but percent has its place. Yeah, so on top of that, there are tons more properties available. If this sketches a few of the available properties and how they behave. But there's tons available. The basics ones will carry you pretty far that we've just covered. But if you're ever wondering what else is available and what else is possible, jump to the CSS reference, right? Don't be afraid to Google things. And don't be afraid to search this website, right? It's full of abilities, full of things you can do. This little cutout I've put on the side, even though it's super zoomed out, that's just the A's and a little bit of the B's. There are tons of properties you can change in CSS land. Okay, so we've learned a bit about the properties that are available and what kinds of things you're able to do to the text of your site or your page, right? Let's talk about selectors. So how do I actually apply them to things, right? So we have all these properties known, and let's talk about how to use them to target specific parts of your web page, right? So we'll discuss the following types. These are the sort of the primary ones again, but as always, there are tons more. Element names, which we should be familiar with by now from HTML stuff. IDs, which we'll talk about. Classes that we can talk about, and pseudo classes. Now again, for lists of many more, check out the W3 School site, but we will get into these four. Okay, element type is the simplest selector. It's just a basic way to have a huge impact on your whole page by just defining a few properties for your main element types, right? So changing the color of all the P elements on your page will just instantly change all the text. Essentially, it wouldn't get the headers, but it would get all of the body text on the page to a new color, right? So there's no special notation for a tag name. You just type the tag name before the curly brace, right? So if you think back to the syntax, you are putting the selector first, and the selector for element names is like this. It's the element name and then whatever your style rules are inside there. You can also apply that same style to multiple types of tags by separating with a comma. So element type 1, element type 2, element type 3, etc. And that also applies to all kinds of selectors. But this is your basic one, right? This is if you say, oh, I would like all of my tables to have these properties and I want to change the padding of all my table data elements, that will have if your page is full of tables, that's going to have a huge impact on your page just defining one TD style rule, right? You can say, I want to change the padding, I want to change the borders, I want to change the colors, all that kind of stuff, as opposed to trying to adjust all that stuff individually, right? You are setting up a selector to run off and say, oh, everything on the page, I'll go change that for you of this particular type. That's all of these, but some of them are more targeted, like ID. So sometimes your page will have, it's not just going to be generic stuff, right? Eventually you'll get to a point, especially if you're building an app, you're going to have very specific individual elements that have different, emphasis. So you might want to style them differently. So yeah, we can access the ID attribute of an element on the page. So this does require you to define that ID attribute, right? So in this example on the right side, we have, the ID of this paragraph is the introduction. And I talk about when I was young lad, something. Up here, we've defined, okay, introduction, the elements that have the ID introduction, I want to change their color to black or whatever, right? So this requires you to set up the HTML ID ahead of time, right? So as long as it's non-blank, it allows you to select for that specific element. The notation is the hashtag before the ID, and then again, you set your style rules. In the HTML segment, you do have to set the attribute of whatever element you want to have this ID. You have to set that before you can use it in CSS land. I know that's obvious when we lay it out, but that's something that you will need to put on your to-do list if you're going to use IDs like this. So basically, this allows you to really target specific things that you might want to treat in a very individualized way. Super useful when you want to highlight something specific or tweak an individual piece of your page that you're going to be using a lot. For example, if you have an interface that has like a main text area where you want people to type things, you might want to just target that specific thing without setting up a whole bunch of other stuff for different types of text areas. Or you may want the header of your page, the biggest top level heading, to look different than all your other H1 headers. You want it to look like the title of my whole website, right? So the point is you can specify things that you want to adjust individually. Note that IDs are meant to be unique to just one element. You're allowed to specify more, but it can behave a little weird if you do that. So think of IDs as this is one spot where this named element is going to exist. And if you want, you can then apply styles to that specific element. The IDs also come up a lot in JavaScript, so just keep these in mind as a way that you interface with HTML. Okay, a third kind of selector, and a very, very useful one is this. I think this is my favorite by far. Sometimes the things you want to define may not align perfectly with just an individual ID or with the existing, the tag names, right? Not the element names. You don't only always want to style things like all paragraphs must be the same, all headers must be the same, etc. So this is a little similar to the ID attribute. It's the class attribute. So again, if I don't necessarily want all of my elements of a particular type to be the same style, or if I want to group elements of the same or of different styles and style them all together. That we saw that a lot on that original example page, right? We would change the text color of just the sidebar, but that sidebar had a header and a paragraph, right? So what you do to define a class is, it's very similar to IDs. What you do is you use the class attribute. And say in the CSS, this would be dot class name. So the dot implies the thing that I'm selecting for is a class, and then whatever the rules are for it. In HTML, that means you have to set the class attribute to have at least one class. Now that's the clever bit here. An element can have as many classes as you want. You just separate them using a space like this. So an element can have some class, another class, etc. Class. Lots of options. In the example over here on the side, we have down at the bottom, we have a bunch of anchors, so a bunch of links, HTML links, linking to different parts of a page or whatever, right? I've given them the class nav item, whereas the anchor inside the main text, according to blah, blah, blah article, that doesn't have that class. So that means that this selector will take all of the just the ones with nav item and apply some kind of coloration to them. In this case, it'll change them all red. Yeah, it'll make them all red. Kind of bright, but whatever. So not every A element will get targeted by this style rule, and that's exactly why it's so powerful. You can now target whole categories. You can come up with a consistent rule for, hey, everything that is a nav item, from now on, I'm just going to label it nav item, and then my style rules will take care of it. I don't have to tweak it. I don't have to mess with it. I can just leave this definition there. Okay, so that's basic element names, that's IDs, and that's classes. Let's talk about pseudo classes. This is a little different, a little weird, but usually it has to do with sort of something about the page has changed. Something about the state of the page may have changed. That's where we can invoke pseudo classes. So elements will often have pseudo classes associated with them. They're determined by the state of the page. For example, A tags have an internal representation of whether or not that link has been visited before. So it has the visited pseudo class. You've seen this by default. Whenever you click on a link, blue links are unclicked and purplish links are clicked, right? That's sort of the vocabulary of color we have come to understand. Those are the default settings for A. So the default color for A is blue, and the default color for A:visited, the pseudo class, is that kind of purplish color. Another example is all elements have the hover pseudo class. So if you hover the mouse over that element, that is now in its hovering state. Now by default, that pseudo class is empty. There's nothing happening in it. But if you do put some color in there, that means when I hover over that item, the color will change because it will invoke a different style, right? So to define these, you need to do, these only ever exist as part of another selector, right? So some element or some, not even just element, whatever other selector you're using, :pseudoclass will then invoke that. So this is a great little step into interactivity. Something we'll do more in JavaScript world, but it's great to have this kind of stuff easily available. So this, again, this hover one, we'll touch on in the demo coming up, but this is the idea that if the state changes, the same exact element might shift to a different style based on what's happening on the page. Okay, and as before, there are tons more selectors and combinations of selectors, plenty. So we've seen a lot of ways to grab elements from the page and apply new styles to them with these selectors. We can do broad, basic work using element names. We can define specific IDs and sets of rules for classes, and we can tap into some states of the system to see, okay, if the system is doing this, I might want to change the style in this way, right? And again, tons of ways to combine all of the above, but that's a little beyond the scope of what we'll need to do. So again, if you're curious, go check out the selectors reference. Okay. To recap, I think we have a good idea now of selectors and properties, I hope at least, how they work together, right? We define which elements we're trying to target with the style rule by using the selector, and then we describe the properties to apply to that set of elements. The element can be just one item if it's an ID, or it can be a whole category that we've defined with classes. Now, let's get to talking about where one can actually put CSS in your web page / website, right? Where to write CSS rules and the many subtle differences between them. There are three main places that you write CSS. One is in an external CSS, external sheet, right? This is very similar to, just having an external file, right? In an external CSS file, you load in from somewhere else in your file structure of your site, right? That's a great way, for example, to, at the top level, you might have a little folder that has CSS in it, and you would use that same sort of site-wide CSS file to just by default load that up on every one of your pages. You're good to go. You have many different pages now invoking the same CSS document. So that's great for setting up things that you might want to use outside of just one page. Internal CSS you can use inside of a page to define everything for just that page, right? There's a lot of elements on a page. You might want to do some page-wide CSS. And this is within the HTML file, right? And then inline CSS is when you just apply some style rules to a specific element using the style attribute. On the right-hand side here, we have some examples of each of these, but let's go into more detail on them. Okay, external CSS. This is where you pull CSS from somewhere else in your file structure, a different file named a CSS file, and beyond outside of an individual HTML. So this is excellent for defining styles you might want to use, reuse, and reuse over and over in your site, right? Then you don't have to define them over and over. You define them once, keep them in a central location, and every other page on your site can access them. Simple example is like, you might want to define the color scheme for your whole website. You don't want to have to be, especially if you did, the upfront work of picking out carefully like which exact hexadecimal values you want for your whole site. You don't want to try to memorize hexadecimal values, right? And you might get them wrong, so, whatever. So you do them all once and you keep them externally stored. Also, what this enables is very nice, is you can tweak things and they will happen everywhere, right? So if I want to change my color scheme eventually, I don't have to run back through 70 files and change every last one of them and make sure that they've all been using the same central style sheet. So it's super useful. I hope that makes sense to you at this point, that this is a great way to store more stable styles, things that you want to sort of generally represent your page. So how do you write these? Writing a CSS file similar to HTML, it starts from an empty page, right? And there's actually no special headings or other syntax. You just write a list of the declarations, just like we did in the syntax, right? So you save them in a file. So here, the example on the right-hand side here is that is a CSS sheet, right? That is a .css file, and it has two declarations in it. H1, and then the color is red, and then P, the color is white, and the background color is black, right? So inverted from normal. And that is the CSS document, right? That's the file. That's all there is inside of it. Now, to load that file, you would use the link tag in the head of your HTML file. So that tag has two attributes. One is rel, which is sort of relevance. What kind of link is this, the browser asks. And you say style sheet in this case. And then the href, that should be familiar from anchors, that allows you to set where the path is to this file, right? Very similar to the a tag. So in this example, I have it showing this link is a style sheet, and the href is in the current folder I'm in, find the CSS folder, and then find the site.css file, right? It's pathing. So that makes it so that we can color a whole website using just one external CSS file. And to really highlight the file structure here, so the left-hand side is the HTML document. It has a body and some text and stuff, and then the way we've defined the link is, okay, hey, style sheet, hey, I'm defining a link, the relevance is that it's a style sheet, and then the href is css/site.css. So the file structure up there is the index is at the main level, and then there is a CSS folder with site.css in it, and that CSS file is over there, right? So these are connected. This is the way you can pipe together your HTML file and the CSS file. Now let's talk internal CSS. It's great to be able to define things across many pages, but sometimes you want to style one page in a very specific way. So to do that, we use the style tag. You would put it in almost the exact same spot that you would put a link to an external CSS, but instead it's the style tag. And inside the style tag, again, the rules are the same. You just write the same way as you did in the other document. You just write it within the style tag. And it's funny because suddenly we're writing a different set of kind of code inside of a different kind of file. We have an HTML file that has CSS code in it. It's fine. That's how it's designed. It loves that stuff. So, right, the same way you might write the text of a P tag, you are writing just an individual set of style rules right here in the tag. So to see this live, or in a live-ish version, here's another document. And this is that same exact style set as the external CSS example, but this is defining it right here in the head as opposed to externally, right? So no external files needed. You can write a page-wide style right there in the page. It's super nice. Now let's get on to the fine-tuning CSS. So inline CSS for item-by-item tweaks, right? Sometimes it just makes the most sense for you to do just one edit in one specific spot. You don't have to get bogged down with like defining IDs or classes or whatever. This is, if you've ever built a thing, you recognize there are times you might need to do individual tweaks. So to apply a single style rule in a single element, or multiple style rules, it's possible. You can just place the style declarations like you do inside the style rules inside an element's style attribute. So element, whatever you're doing, like paragraph or whatever, style equals those same declarations, right? Now, remember, in this case, note that you won't have to use any selectors, right? You don't have to figure out what selectors you, because you have selected the element yourself. I am saying, hey, change the properties of this element. You do need to make sure you pay attention in this case, to separating the declarations using a semicolon. You're always allowed to do that, but in this case you have to, because there's no like new lines to help the system separate things. It'll just explode. And I say explosions, code crashes. It's okay. You don't have to worry about that word explosion. But just it'll throw errors. So as a guiding rule, if you find yourself writing a lot of inline CSS, especially repetitively, you might want to consider the other options to define things at a broader level than just individually. So here's two more examples. H1 style color is red. Paragraph style color is white. Background color is black. Here again is the same exact CSS defined in the body, or rather inside the style attributes of all of the elements in the body. Again, it says the same rules, right? The headers are red, the paragraphs are white, and with black backgrounds. You can see that already this is pretty repetitive, right? We have defined the same rules in multiple spots over and over. And again, imagine trying to tweak that. Also, a side note, I included the link here by mistake. I did not mean to. I was editing these documents and trying to move things around to illustrate things. It's not, ignore that part. So that's the idea. You have 3 different basic ways to get CSS into your document. Leading us to the recap, we got those 3 ways. External CSS, great for broad, general, and stable style rules. You use the link element for those. Internal CSS is great for writing broad rules, but just for one page. Use the style element for that. And then inline CSS is great for specific tweaks to individual elements. Use an element's style attribute to make individual adjustments. Okay. Next, here's the conundrum, right? If I have multiple declarations, which one should be used, right? And it gets a bit technical, but it's something to just keep your mind on here and there. So we see lots of ways to define the style of elements on our pages, right? But the curious is we can define the color of the same paragraph element in a lot of places. We have our external files and our internal styles on the page, and then our inline CSS. But also, you might have multiple declarations in the same CSS file that apply different things, right? So element names, one individual element could have a name, an ID, and a class, all of which could be defined in multiple places, right? The question is which style ultimately gets applied? And maybe more importantly, which one should I, the programmer, expect the system to use so that I don't make errors, right? So this is where the concept of priority comes into play. Cascade priority. And we're going to just stick to some broad guidelines. There's a lot of technical ways that this works. But when it's trying to answer the question, when it comes down to it, what color should this text be, right? So, the major guiding thought to start, we covered before, more specific style rules have a higher priority than more general style rules. To get a little deeper here, this is some sort of priorities as they are depicted. So this little character set here, the double brackets, means is higher priority than. It's like greater than, right? So first concept is scope. Inline CSS beats internal CSS, which typically beats external CSS, right? So I might have I might have style rules at the full website level, but if I'm declaring an inline style, that will win. That will always beat the external style. Then specificity of the selector. IDs are the most unique and the most individual, and so those need a higher priority, right? Classes are also more unique than element types, so those get a little more priority than element types, and element types get the minimum priority. Recency is the next one. So assuming everything else is the same, let's say there's no IDs, but it is all internal CSS, right? Then now it comes down to recency. So assuming everything's the same, which one was applied last will take priority. So since files are read top to bottom, rules that appear lower in your CSS file will be given higher priority if they are the same rule. So the last one applied gets the application. And the same applies if you're doing classes. So when you're defining an elements class list, remember those are read left to right. So you have multiple classes defined. The rightmost class will take priority over the leftmost class. And again, more of this is available on CSS specificity, a piece of the W3 School site. Another note on the side here, this has been up the whole time. The idea priority is actually of numerical value because, hey, computers really only function on numbers, so it must have a way of calculating the priority. And this is just like a geeky fact. You don't have to memorize this, but elements and pseudo elements. So the element type selectors will contribute a priority of 1. If it's a class selector, it gets an extra boost of a priority of 10. IDs contribute a priority of 100, and inline styles give it a priority of 1,000. Whichever style wins is the one applied to an element. So you get your priority by kind of crunching the numbers here. You won't ever have to do that. Just remember sort of the general rules and get comfortable with trial and error. If something is not applying, you now know roughly how to search for what's wrong, right? Now you'll at least have a theory of, there must be something that's like overriding this, or there must be something, maybe I left an inline style tag somewhere and I didn't realize it, right? Or not inline style tag, inline style declaration. Okay. Another bit of this, another way that styles can cascade is inheritance. So nested HTML objects can also inherit their parents' HTML properties. So quick example, if I say, hey, I want this unordered list to have the background light gray, right? The li elements inside that list will also now have light gray backgrounds by default, or rather beating the default. The default would be, hey, everything is by default white background. So this is the idea that you can set the properties of an external element or a container, for example, and that will help change all of the things inside of it. It can be used to great effect with containers. So the body, for example, you can set things at the body level like color and background color. And then everything contained inside the body that doesn't have other rules written for it will just default to whatever you defined at the body level. So an example on the side here, we have the unordered list has the style background color light gray, color red. Then you see that the things bullet, the first things bullet, follows all those rules. There's no special styles applied to it. It's fine. Then if you add, the style color is black to the second things. Okay, so that's reverted the color for that individual element. And then the third one, we don't change the color. We do change the background color back to white. You see what it does. It is a little funny that the marker is still different, but that's its own thing we can discuss. But so that's the idea of inheritance. So a quick recap on cascade priority inheritance, just because it's tricky stuff and it's important to tie it up. There's lots of ways that style rules flow down throughout your page. There's this sense of priority. So specific styles are rated as more important, inline styles or IDs. And then when all else is equal, the most recent style will win as well. There's also this sense of inheritance. So if you define a style for a container, provided no other rules are written for the specific elements within it, those elements will inherit their parent element's rules. So setting the background and text color of your whole document by just styling the body tag. All right, a bit left. It would be remiss of me not to continue to talk about the DOM throughout, right? So we've discussed all these great ways that we can mess with the styles here, right? But there is still a question about what exactly is, does the CSS get in there and mix it up with our HTML, right? So keeping all the data in mind. Remember, the information is our key here. So with HTML, recall the document object model is the way that HTML elements are stored internally as data objects by the browser, right? As the document object tree is created, all the relevant CSS is also parsed and applied to those trees objects. So each element object has a style property that contains its own data object that captures the properties that have been applied and the values of those properties. So essentially, it's the same as when we wrote the style. All that is saying is, hey, shove this data into those objects, and then I'll see you later. It's by the time that the system goes to the output end, when it goes to render the page, it will check the DOM tree and say, okay, these things have style properties, they have values, and I'm going to apply those values the best way I know how. If there isn't a value, then it just uses the browser defaults. Those basic things like the color of the text should be black and the background color should be white. So no matter what, the browser is still making some kind of decision about what to draw. It just has defaults. So when you add style, it changes those defaults. Let's do an example. So here's a tag with some inline CSS and the ID title. So this is a header. It has the color red, background color is black, and the ID is title. Great. I'm going to run a quick bit of JavaScript to grab that element out of the data, out of the DOM. Again, we aren't too JavaScript yet. I'm just exposing it to you early. So this is a header. And what I've done is grab the header's data object. So I have in the variable X, I have the data object for the header. Okay, so that data object has a style object inside of it. It has its own whole stuff. So now I can look at the style object of X. X, again, being the header, right? We've just pulled the header's data out to have a look at it. Sort of like fishing. We pull you up and we're going to examine you. So now we're saying, okay, so the first thing is that the numerical addresses of this style object, so if I put numbers into the brackets when I'm asking, hey, style, what's in you? Those give you what style properties have been changed and in what order. Again, useful, helpful for keeping track of things. And then if we go and look for those named addresses, we can ask, okay, hey, style, what color is this element supposed to be? Aha, it has the word red. Hey, style element. Hey, header elements style object. What should the background color be? It's been defined as black here. So the named addresses of this object have the same properties that we put in at the style tag up here, the style attribute up here. Again, all this being so that we can allow the renderer, when the page is drawn on the screen, it will know what to do. It'll be like, hey, I'm going to draw this element now. Ooh, its color is red and its style is black. Glad I kept track of that. That's what the user asked me to do. Okay. So let's get to some tips. Just some thoughts while you move through doing this kind of writing for CSS. As before, I want to talk about commenting in whitespace. So you want to keep track of your CSS in a way that is neat and readable, right? So what's CSS's deal with whitespace? CSS also doesn't really care about whitespace, just like HTML doesn't. You can get pretty funky with the way you organize it. As long as you follow the syntax that we discussed, right? The selector and the curly braces and all these things, your rules can all be on one line, or maybe better, and maybe following the styles I've shown you so far, separate things out onto individual lines so it's clean and clear, right? Comments are also available. You can leave comments in CSS using this format. So /* is the start, and then whatever your note is going to be, and then */. Again, super useful for being able to leave information about what you're even doing here, right? Now, If you're just going to change a couple of colors, you don't need to do a whole lot of documentation. But at a certain point, your code gets a little unwieldy. It's good to leave some information around. Like this area is where I change all the colors. This area is where I change all the behavior, whatever. So just like with HTML, you're trying to keep your other readers in mind, like me or future you. So keep the white space and comments in mind. They're useful. Your code doesn't care if they're there or not. So remember, it's for you, and it's totally fine to leave yourself notes or leave me notes or whatever. As far as bugs go, CSS is a little more picky than HTML, but it's still pretty forgiving. So let's say you misspell a property. What happens? Let's say I misspell the background color property here. The only thing that is ignored is the specific declaration that you messed up, right? So me declaring background color as black, it skips that, but it's still properly read. The color should be red. You see on the example? So all the declarations in the rule are still applied. It just skips the ones that are broken. So if something isn't quite working, just remember that this is how it breaks, right? It may be a specific declaration is busted, not your whole rule is off. Also, if you're using a text editor with syntax highlighting for CSS, it really helps. It shows you things like, hey, the misspelled property is the wrong color. Normally these things are all kind of bluish. This one is like, hey, I have no idea what that property is. Sorry. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our segment on writing CSS. Recap. All right. If we want to apply styles to our HTML pages, we write CSS. Style rules use a selector to determine which elements to target, and then a list of declarations of properties and values, property-value pairs, is applied to the selected elements, changing the way they're displayed in terms of fonts, colors, dimensions, and tons more. We can keep CSS in external CSS files, internally in the HTML file in a style tag, or inline in individual elements using the style attribute. Because a single element can have many conflicting styles applied to it, we should keep aware of the priority of declarations with the general rule that specific beats general. And as with all code, you try to keep it tidy and readable using whitespace and comments. Okay. Before we go, let's revisit the first example, just to get our eyes on it. So this is our stupid example page again. It's a page designed to highlight style sheets being applied to itself. Here's the code again. So now we can break this code up and maybe do a little bit of highlighting of areas. Let's look at the menu bar section. So this is a div, right? The div has the menu bar ID. That's good to know. Then that as we've discussed now, that's a way that the CSS can be used to snatch and restyle things. The unordered list has the ID menu list. The list items all have the class menu item. So now thinking about this in terms of CSS, menu item is obviously a class that they've defined. And when we shift the page around, we might see that those menu items are shifting together. They all will have the same CSS applied to them. Let's keep moving a bit. So here's the main. Here's like where all the main information for the page is supposed to be. Here's the sidebar. And here's the bottom text, right? So now we have this, and we've highlight all of the individual chunks. Okay, so let's follow these. Let's try to follow these visually as we move through the different versions of this page. Here's style sheet 1. If we look here, I like to pay specific attention to those menu items. Look, they're all the same-ish, right? Even though they're just list items, because they have the class menu item, this specific kind of list item we might want. They've all gotten the same style treatment to them. Before, I'll go back real quick. They're just text. They're just bullet points, right? But now, click, we see them as all similarly styled, uniquely menu item-y looking objects. The same applies to everything here, right? So all these different areas are getting set up in different ways. Continuing on, we can follow the same practice here. So at the top and on the right side now, we have those same menu items, but they're all different colors and different arrangements have happened. Here's another version of the page. Similar story here. We see the menu bar at the top. We see the main section here, sidebar and bottom. Again, these are the individual IDs of the containers. And again, we see here, upper left looks like the menu area. We've got the sidebar in the upper right. We've got the main page in the bottom text. We can see it all come together. Okay, so let's get out of here. What's the recap? HTML is used to define the content and structure of a document. CSS is used to sculpt the presentation of that same content. Serving both an aesthetic purpose, just for the sake of, having style, which is nice, but also a user functional purpose, as the way you emphasize and organize the content visually can aid your users in understanding the information you're showing them. Huge variety of properties are available to customize the look and elements of your page. And you can very flexibly apply these styles to just one element using inline CSS or your whole dang website using CSS files. And that's the up and down. Let's get out of here. Thanks for coming along. Let's have our final thought as usual. Consider the variety of options we've covered here and go browse a few websites you're familiar with or the school site. Which style properties do you now find most noticeable? Which do you think are used to great effect, and which do you think aren't so much? All right, that's it. Thanks. Take care.